This is the beginning of our core competency workshop series. And this one is our first of the 2024-2025 school year. It's on PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, who they are and what they fund. And our speaker and our presenter today and creator of the entire workshop series is Dr. Douglas Landsittel. And we are going to be talking a little bit about first the core competency workshop series in general. We have a bunch of workshop series that we're going to be doing this particular semester. And we have 5 PCORI, we have 3 qualitative, which are in person, qualitative study design and data analysis, and there's some BIRD introduction to clinical practice type things coming up, and it's specifically with biostatistics. So I have down here on this PowerPoint the 5 workshops for our PCORI series, and he will be talking a little bit about some of them, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. Our 3 qualitative, which are just about filled up, if not completely filled up today, so I'm probably going to have a waiting list for some people, and that's with Dr. Bouchard and Lilvis. And then finally, we have dates for our BIRD series, but we're waiting for a little bit of information on all of them. And there's 4 of them for our Introduction to Clinical Trials, and that's a biostatistics series. And it will continue actually next semester with more advanced information. I do want to tell you that we have a lot of core competency workshop series, and we talked about the ones we're running this semester. We'll run different ones next semester, and what's important is that some of them are yearly, others build on each other, and however are every other year. So you're going to see some advertisement for some of the series coming up soon. I know you saw the qualitative one, and the BIRD one is coming. And then when we get into the spring semester, you'll see responsible conduct of research, health and equities. We're also going to be writing a single biomedical informatics workshop that will lead into a summer biomedical informatics boot camp. We'll run scientific communication as well. So there's a bunch of series we're going to be running in the spring too. And again, if you decide that you want to attend every one of the workshops in this series, you'll receive a certificate of completion about a week or 2 after the series is completed, and that's after November 18th. We also have people can qualify for continuing medical education credits if you would like them. 7.5 CME credits would be available for this workshop if you do need them. I automatically send people who attend the entire series to the Office of Continuing Medical Education, and then they actually apply that to you if you happen to want to receive them. And finally, there's going to be a survey. We really need the survey because of the fact that it really helps us with our funding sources, and it also helps us to improve our workshops. It's incredibly short, very confidential, and really should only take you a couple minutes. I'm going to place it in the chat at approximately 5 p.m. and then I'll do it again at 5:20, and I'll be sending it to you a couple times as well. So if you've already completed it, feel free to ignore the emails, and we greatly appreciate your support. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask myself, Catherine Sedota. I'm going to be the facilitator for today's presentation. My cohort member is Elizabeth Bangert, and I am under Katya Noyes, and I should also put Dave Jacobs under here because he is our associate director, which I will be adding very, very soon. Okay, I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Landsittel.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to attempt to share my slides now. Did that work? Okay, great. As was mentioned, I'm going to talk about the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, today, who they are and what they fund. I do have spots in the middle and maybe about 2/3, 3/4 through for questions, but you could interrupt me also as I go if there's something that's a burning question. I try to keep the slides short with without too much text to allow time for questions. So I hope we can get some questions and you can ask things about your own research. So a few things about me before we start. I've been a biostatistician for longer than I will admit to. I've worked in the government, and I've also worked in more of teaching position, and then also worked in Cancer Institute and medical school at Pittsburgh, and was the chair of epidemiology and biostatistics at Indiana University before coming here. So I have a lot of experience with related topics to PCORI. More specifically, I was a principal investigator on a PCORI methods contract. So we looked at best practices with causal inference related to observational comparative effectiveness, and a PI on an R25, which is a research education grant that was funded by HRQ, but was through the PCOR trust funds, where we developed training materials for faculty at minority serving institutions. I was a co-I on a PCORI trial of healthcare systems interventions that's working on a publication now. I've also been a consultant on a number of other PCORI projects. And then while I was at Pittsburgh for a number of years before I went to Indiana and then Buffalo, I was part of our Comparative Effectiveness Research Center, or CERC, at Pittsburgh. And that's really kind of what's inspired me to give these workshops and reach out to people to think about PCORI funding. We did a lot of these kinds of webinars and seminars and reviewing PCORI proposals. And we had a lot of success too, actually. PCORI does not publish their top funded institutions, but they do put their funding on the website. And we had our administrator go through at one point, and combining institutes and medical centers, we determined that Pitt UPMC was #2 to Harvard and Mass General at one point, PCORI funding. So I think having these kinds of efforts to talk about PCORI funding, talk about what's different, can make it a lot easier to actually be successful. So that's what I'm hoping to do. I've contributed to a lot of PCORI applications, many times just giving a critical review. And I've been a reviewer for PCORI. I've chaired about 4 of their review panels. So I have spent a lot of time on PCORI and related topics over the last 10 or 15 years. So it's really a topic I enjoy talking about. So the list of workshops with Catherine had this up. These are all Mondays at 4 to 5:30. Today, we're going to talk about PCORI's mission and how they're different from NIH. So what I really see here is just kind of setting the context for what is PCORI about. Again, how are they different from NIH, since that's what a lot of us are used to. And then in a couple of weeks, I'll have a workshop on the ABCs of PCORI funding and their review process. So it's a related set of topics to today, but their funding really has a lot of intricacies to it that's really helpful to understand. And their review process is really different than a lot of institutions. So I think it's worth a separate hour and a half to talk about. After that, in the third workshop, I'll dive deeper into the methodology standards that PCORI has. So they have over 60 different standards for how you should handle things like missing data, heterogeneity of treatment effects, making causal inferences, characterizing complex interventions. You name it, they have a methodology standard for it. And there are also other expectations they have for pragmatic studies. So in the third workshop, I really want to do a bit of a deeper dive into those requirements. The fourth workshop will be on PCORI's current funding priorities. And what I hope to do is help people see if, yeah, you know what, my research really fits in well to that, or maybe it doesn't at this time. And really kind of try to give some insight as to the things that they're funding right now. So some relationship to the second workshop, but looking at more specifics on they call them program function announcements, or PFAs. And then the last one, which I hope to use input that I hear from the first 4 workshops, is to talk about ideas for advancing PCORI funding at UB and across SUNY. So as you may or may not know, the Vice President for Health Sciences, Dr. Bashir's office, is doing a lot of events to try to spur on large funding mechanisms, especially with PCORI. And there are other kind of collaborations that are coming out of that. So I would like to just use that 5th workshop to, throw out some ideas, hear from people, and chat about what can we do at UB and SUNY to really have an impact on PCORI funding, because the good thing is they do have a lot of money. There's a lot of challenges with going after PCORI funding, but there's rewards to be sure. Okay. As I said, I'm going to leave time for questions around halfway through and near the end of the presentation. So please put on your thinking cap, get ready to ask questions. And like I said, if I say something you have a real burning question for, I'm happy to pause also. Okay. So with that in mind, I just want to get a sense of who I'm talking to. So I have a poll, if you could put that up, Catherine, where I'd just like to hear about your knowledge about funding applications and PCORI funding. So I'll let you answer.
They are starting to answer right now.
All right. I used to always read them, and then my students complained they couldn't
Okay.
concentrate because I was
Not a
talking.
problem. I do have
Yeah.
the question and all of the responses directly on the poll, so
Okay.
they should be okay. Just about good. Okay, I'm going to end.
Okay.
And I'm going to share the results. Can you see them?
I can, but I've been able to the whole time, so I'm not.
Can everybody else see them? I'm thinking we're okay.
All right, great. So it looks like, and I have to put on my reading glasses to even read this. So it looks like around half, or 43%, say have little to no experience writing any funding proposals, and a little over half say some experience, but not much with PCORI. One person that says they have a lot of PCORI, but want to learn more. And fortunately for me, I don't have anyone that feels they should be teaching the workshop instead of me. So
Excellent.
okay.
I'm going to stop sharing this.
Okay, great.
And just continue. Okay, great.
All right. So thank you. That helps give me some idea. So I want to start with a few key concepts. And I think from what I just saw in the poll, I'm glad that I have this section of slides where I just want to start and say, what are some of the main concepts, main terms that we talk about with PCORI, that PCORI expects you to know and write your proposals around. And also in doing this, I want to give a bit of a history lesson on where PCORI, how PCORI came into being, because I think that's a big part of who they are and what they fund. And if you sort of understand, it's like anything with history, I guess, that if you understand the history of it, it's easier to succeed. So I want to give a bit of a history lesson. And I'll talk about what do I mean by comparative effectiveness research, patient-centered outcomes research, and patient-centered comparative effectiveness research. They're all related terms, but a little bit different. Okay. So first is the term comparative effectiveness research. And there's some different definitions out there. The most concise was it published in a paper by Slutsky and Clancy. I believe it was Clancy, who's the former director of AHRQ. And so in that paper, they use the definition, what healthcare treatment works best, for whom, and under which circumstances. So very short definition, but there's a lot of information in there. So what treatment works best, that kind of infers that we're comparing multiple treatments. For whom? So there's something about different people, maybe different treatments work differently for different people and under what circumstances. So one thing we'll see with comparative effectiveness research is there's a focus on pragmatic settings. So looking at interventions not in this perfectly controlled world of clinical trials that we often deal with NIH, but out in the real world. A little more voluminous definition talks about CER as generation synthesis of evidence that compares both benefits and harms of any intervention, whether it be preventing, diagnosing, treating, monitoring, procedures, screening methods, health system intervention, anything you can think of to improve delivery of care. How does that assist? They want to gather evidence to assist consumers, clinicians, purchasers, policymakers to improve healthcare, both for individual people and at the population level. Okay? So that also has a lot of information in that definition. I actually like this one the best. This is from an IOM committee where they published 6 characteristics of CER. So they said CER is where you have a clinical decision. And this is one important point for PCORI. For you to have really almost anything funded by PCORI, you have to talk about a clinical decision of interest where there's a decisional dilemma. If you don't have that, it probably doesn't fit into PCORI. So CER looks at informing a clinical decision, again, from a public health perspective and a patient perspective, and in a way that's comparing at least 2 interventions or more, each with the potential of best practice. So when we talk about comparative effectiveness, we mean that what we're comparing, we already know it's efficacious. So we're not looking at treatment versus placebo. We're not looking at developing a new intervention. We're not looking at safety of some intervention that we want to look at in the future. We're taking at least 2 interventions, treatments, medications, whatever. And we know they work some of the time for some of the people, but what works better for whom? Okay. CER, again, you're hearing the same themes already. Population level, subgroup level, and measure benefits and harms. So this is one of the things with development of CER. This was a paper that was published or a report in 2009, where it really stressed that a lot of research we do is looking at benefits without looking at things like adverse events or maybe effect on your quality of life. And then finally, CER should employ appropriate methods, which is going to be a big part of PCORI, and conducted in pragmatic settings. So again, not in this well-controlled vacuum of a randomized trial where we say we're going to take really specific inclusion criteria. We're going to take people between 25 and 35 with no comorbidities. That's sort of the NIH exploratory trial world. CER, PCORI is on the opposite end of that. They want to evaluate things as they're done in practice. So I will say the importance of CER has been recognized for a long time. Before CER, we often called it outcomes and effectiveness research. This relates to a lot of work at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, other places. There was the IOM committee and report around 2009 I mentioned. There was actually, and I know you're thinking the word bipartisan is a typo, that can't be right, but there was actually bipartisan support for a CER institute in the 90s or so, maybe into 2000s. And as part of, if you remember, in 2009, when the economy was in a depression and there was this American Recovery and Reinvestment funding, 24 billion went to research, much of that to NIH, but 1.1 billion went to comparative effectiveness research and developing infrastructure, planning, funding, capacity building efforts. That's where we started our Center for, or Comparative Effectiveness Research Center when I was at Pittsburgh. And so this is an idea that's been around for a while. Unfortunately, well, whereas unfortunately, I guess, that hype sort of eventually, and I'll say temporarily, died off. So after there was a lot of support for this idea of we should invest in comparative effectiveness research, we should have a CER institute, then there were concerns and I'll say political friction over will this lead to rationing? Will we tell people, no, you can't get approved for that medication, or you have to take this medication? So those were some of the concerns that had come out of this. And the idea sort of died off until the Affordable Care Act. So in 2010 or so, PCORI was created as part of the Affordable Care Act. And I just copy and pasted a screenshot from the actual, so this is actually in the ACA legislation that establishes this Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So there's subtitle D of the ACA is on patient-centered outcomes research. And as part of that, it establishes, the ACA established PCORI not as a government institute, but as an independent nonprofit research funding organization, which I always thought was the most ironic thing in the government. So if you remember the government shutdown around that time, PCORI, which was as in the middle of all that as anything, because it was created out of the ACA, was actually open and running while the government was shut down, because it was not a government institute, in fact. PCORI, so the legislation says PCORI needs to establish a board. Shouldn't be directors, it's actually a board of governors. They needed to establish a methodology committee, and they needed to establish methodology standards for how work was done. And I think a lot of this comes out of the fact that we don't think of the ACA as having all this controversy around it quite as much anymore, but there was a lot around that time it was established. And I think there's a really strong desire to say, we need to make sure everything coming out of being funded by this institute is with strong methodology behind it. So there's a lot of focus on methodology. There was actually a clause to sunset PCORI after 10 years if it did not get legislative approval for reauthorization. So there was a lot of thinking back in 2020 that it was absolutely going to get shut down, but it didn't. It got refunded for another 10 years as part of a, I'll say, bipartisan friendly group of research, nonprofit research funding organizations. So it is in place at least until 2030. PCORI, interestingly, was also tasked with defining PCOR. Now, I don't ever remember an institute being formed and being told, okay, you're the institute of this, and you have to define what this actually is. But that was the case. They were created and said, this is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And the first thing you have to do is you have to tell us what patient-centered outcomes research is. So PCORI did that. This is their rather voluminous definition of what PCOR is, and it actually goes on for a while. But the main point that they say is that Patient-centered outcomes research helps people and their caregivers make informed decisions about healthcare in a way that answers 4 questions. One is, for me, my characteristics, my conditions, and my preferences. What disease do I have? What severity do I have? What do I care about? Do I care about how long I live? Or do I care about how high my quality of life is for the short term? For all of that, what should I expect will happen to me? What's going to happen to me on things I care about? And then what can I do about it? What are my options? What are the treatments out there? What are the benefits and harms of those potential treatments? And then how can I use that information to improve the outcomes that I care about the most? And finally, how can others, my doctors, the healthcare delivery systems, insurance, help me make the best decisions about healthcare? So what does this look like to me? What can I do, and how can others help me? That's essentially the idea of PCORI. So I'll just mention here, this doesn't exactly line up with CER. There's nothing in here that says, I mean, there is where it says, what are my options or what are potential benefits? But it doesn't directly say PCORI needs to compare A versus B, experimental treatment versus standard. It's much more focused on the outcomes, the patient perspective outcomes, and how you can intervene. Okay. So this has led to a variation of these 2 themes, which PCORI now says that they focus on, which is patient-centered CER. So if you're going to apply to PCORI, your project should be in the category of patient-centered CER. So what do we mean? Well, one, it needs to meet all those 6 definitions of CER. Comparing A to B on harms and benefits, patient at the population level and the patient level, looking at best methods. It may need to be in pragmatic settings. I missed one of the 6, but all those things need to be part of your research question. It also needs to focus on the patient perspective and considering all the options, their preferences, what matters to them. Okay. And just to quantify that, if you go under PCORI and about PCORI, you will see that I just copied a screenshot. What we do, we fund patient-centered, and they put the word clinical in here too, patient-centered comparative clinical effectiveness research. So they're really focused on clinical research. I mean, they're focused on, I think a lot of what they do could be under like translational science too, but they're not focused on basic science. They're focused on clinical research and research-related rewards, and they issue funding announcements several times a year. By the way, they call their funding announcements program funding announcements instead of requests for funding announcements. So you'll hear the term PFA. Okay, I'm going to do a second poll, and after I do the poll, we'll stop for questions again.
Great,
So
you have 2 questions, so we'll run them first, and then I will tell you the questions that are in the chat.
Great.
Great, so, okay, I will run poll number 2. Okay, which of the following is potentially a patient-centered CER study?
I think we can.
I think we're good. We can end this poll.
Yeah.
Okay, so share the results, and I think you can see them.
Okay, so this is great. A lot of people, let me see. Oh, and I actually can't. Oh, I see.
So a lot of people think that it's 3. So 89% said investigators in rehabilitation sciences compare reductions in back pain from chiropractic methods versus PT sessions. And then you have a small amount in 1, 2, and 4, but most of them have responded 3.
So that's great. 3 was the answer I was looking for. Let's take just a minute before I go to questions. So let's talk through each of these very quickly. So first choice said investigators in pharmaceutical sciences test a new vaccine for COVID safety and efficacy in healthy college students. So there's a few things here that make it not CER. Number one, we want pragmatic settings where this is useful information for as broad of a patient population as possible. So looking at healthy college students makes sense in that when we're testing safety of something, makes sense. We probably don't want to give it to someone who's elderly with a lot of comorbidities, but that is more on the end, less on the pragmatic end. Plus, looking at safety and efficacy rather than comparative effectiveness. Second, investigators in exercise and nutrition science evaluate negative reactions of two different levels of CO2 exposure and experienced firefighters. So here we're looking at exposures, not interventions, medications. So we really don't have anything in terms of comparative effectiveness. So in general, when we talk about risk factors, exposures, that type of thing, that's in a different world from CER. If I skip to the fourth one, investigators in social work evaluate whether a new app for remote cognitive behavioral therapy reduces anxiety. Again, that word new is a red flag that we don't have a known to be efficacious treatment. So in general, in CER, what we want, and I'm going to have more examples as we go to really enforce this point, but in general, or not in general, but just specifically with CER, we're looking at 2 or more interventions that could be considered best practices. Now, the third choice, investigators in rehab sciences compare reductions in back pain from chiropractic methods versus PT sessions. So we have 2 treatments. Maybe we could argue whether both are known to be efficacious, but those are methods that are out there. They're being used a lot in practice. So it seems reasonable that we're looking at comparative effectiveness of these. Back pain sounds like something that patients would care about. And I don't see any restrictions on the patients, the inclusion criteria, et cetera. So I think 3, although we don't have a lot of information, is probably our best answer for CER example. So let me go to questions, and do you want to just read those off for me, Catherine?
Absolutely. Yes, Kelly is wondering, can you define clinical decision in more detail? And I have a little more, so I'll get back to the question in a moment. Does PCORI include interventions that improve decision-making by community-based practitioners like public health or community health workers, social workers, and place-based clinical staff like school nurse, or is it strictly about clinic-based settings? So I think she specifically wanted about clinical decisions in more detail based on that.
Okay, great. So there's a couple of questions embedded in there. So one is, I'll get to the last part first, which is it strictly clinical settings? No, it's not strictly clinical settings. So it is focused, when I say comparative clinical, or the clinical comparative effectiveness research, it is clinical in that we're looking at things like healthcare, clinical outcomes, those type of things, but it might be in other settings. So it could be comparing school-based intervention to community settings. It could be looking at comparative effectiveness of 2 different decision tools. So yes, to that part, it's more broad than just like in a hospital. Also, I think that you asked about decision tools or decision support. for making healthcare decisions. And when PCORI was first funded, they funded a lot of decision tools and decision support kind of mechanisms. And one of the reviews I was at, actually, Joe Selby, who was the founding director of PCORI, showed this pie chart of what they had funded. And this is maybe after a couple of years. So this might have been like in 2012, 2013 or something when they had started. And he showed this pie chart, and development of decision tools was like 35% of their funding. And I remember he looked at it and he went, wow, okay, not what I would have thought. He said, that's nothing wrong funding decision tools, but we're really here to fund comparative effectiveness. You've got A, you've got B, they work some of the time for some of the people. Which one works better for whom? And PCORI has these letters of intent. And I remember telling a colleague, I said, you know what? I will bet you any money the letters of intent are going to be competitive from now on so that they can push for more programmatic issues that they care about. And sure enough, next week, I heard an announcement. PCORI is going to do competitive letters of intent. And they have since shifted away from these developing questionnaires. They used to fund those, also developing psychometric scales or psychometric instruments to measure patient-centered outcomes. They don't fund that. They don't fund the development of decision tools. What they do fund is the studies of them. So you can say, hey, I have two different ways. My patients come in, let's say this is a depression study. So patients come in, maybe we do this web-based app that helps them kind of do the self-guided tour to understand what's bothering them, and that kind of helps them talk to their physician. Or maybe they go in and they have a nurse who counsels them through. So those are two different ways. Let's compare those to the end outcomes. That would be, now again, you have to get into, is there enough evidence to say both of those ways are efficacious? But if you say that yes, then that would be comparative effectiveness. But development of the app or the instrument is not CR. So let me go to the next one because I've blurred on for that.
Excellent. So this is Jiben, and they say that they are a basic researcher studying head and neck cancer using animal and patient samples, not a provider. Am I qualified to apply for any category in the PCORI funding opportunity?
So if it's animal studies, I think, and I hate to just be bluntly and say no, but I think the answer is no. They want patients, they want studies, and I'll talk about this in the second half of the slides, all about patients. So preclinical or in vivo kind of studies, that's not going to fall into PCORI at all.
Those are the only questions in the chat.
Okay.
And I think probably we can wait for more for the end, or I will just take them as we're going along.
Yeah, let me just pause for a second and say if there are any other questions people want to ask. If not, we'll move on. Okay, hearing none, I'll move on. There's a pause at the end too. Okay, so I say finish, but I still actually have.
Actually, we do have one more. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's all right.
Does PCORI fund global work? This was from Kelly.
Global work. So as long as it fits in to their other, that it's patient-centered, that's comparative effectiveness research. The challenge with global work that one might run into from a funding perspective, I think in some cases is the translation back to the health of the US population. But sometimes that's an easy argument to make. Sometimes it's a little tougher. For instance, I'll mention I have a PhD student who's not here back where I was at IU, that they're at Indiana, and they're looking at patient trajectories through healthcare systems in Democratic Republic of Congo. And we've had discussion about funding, and I've told them that they've worried about this. And they said, oh, I've heard that it's really hard. I can't get funded if it's not US. I said, it's not really true. You have to, unless it's something that's specific to global questions, if it's about the usual NIH kind of grants, you have to relate it to the health of the US population. So I said, for you, you have a population or a sampling frame in the DRC that has a lot more late-stage cancer. So you can ask questions about risk factors with late-stage cancer and survival, with treatment-naive patients who have progressed, that we just don't have that kind of data in the US, so you can relate it back. Now, so for PCORI, you would have to be able to relate it back to a patient-centered comparative effectiveness research question that a patient, I think, and I don't actually ever remember them saying specific to the US, but I've been on a lot of PCORI reviews, and I think they would have to relate back to, oh, this is in Africa, but you know what, this will give us unique information that allows a patient in the US to better answer their decisional dilemma. And I realized too, let me just expand for a minute. What do I mean by decisional dilemma? So that's saying for a given patient, let's say there are a couple of medications I could take. So I could take a more aggressive experimental therapy that would, many times this comes up with cancer. So do I take the more aggressive, more experimental therapy that I think is my best shot at really either going into remission or having a long survival? Or do I prioritize my quality of life right now and think about other kinds of health factors? So there's a decisional dilemma. There's not I'm just not sure which treatment is the best one for me. And that's really what PCORI focuses on. And I'll get to their review criteria, and I think they'll get at the question even more. Okay, so let me move on. So I say finish, but I still have a fair number of slides to go. But I could go through these a little more quickly if we run down on time. I want to give some anecdotal stories and overall lessons with the remaining 10 slides or so. And I originally, when I was putting together the talk, I kind of focused on like, oh, where do I find the reference for this? And I remember so-and-so told me that, but like, was he referencing when he talked about 38 diabetes medications, like, what were those? Where can I find the systematic review paper? And then I thought, you know what? Actually, I think sometimes when you hear anecdotal stories, it hits home and clarifies topics much more. So I'm not going to try to find the references. I'm just going to convey some anecdotal stories and kind of wrap this up in some overall lessons. And a couple of the underlying points, again, PCORI is not NIH, and PCORI wants research done differently. And I just kind of want to emphasize those points. And I'll say at the end, I'm going to talk about some suggestions I have, and I will weave this through all workshops, suggestions I have for concrete things you can do in PCORI to improve your chances for funding. Yeah. So I want to start with one anecdotal story, and I mentioned the one thing about decision tools, and I was at a PCORI review and before COVID, when things were in person, and the PCORI director, Joe Selby, was talking over dinner, which, by the way, the fact that they're not the government means they can serve you food, which is really nice for a review. Although now they've not been in person, so I guess that's not relevant now. But so Joe Selby was talking, and he started by saying, PCORI is not NIH. In his words, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, NIH is really good at what NIH does. They come up with new mechanisms that lead to new information about mutations that allow us to target new therapies, and they see if those therapies are safe, if they can work, and then start seeing if they do work in limited settings. We're not trying to be NIH. We are something different. And specifically, we want to look at cases where there's 2 or more known to be efficacious treatments, interventions, approaches, health system, systems approaches, whatever it is, 2 or more approaches where there's some decisional dilemma, and we want to give the patient more information for informed healthcare decisions to let them influence outcomes they care about. And there's this cartoon, I couldn't find it, but it was somewhere in the PCORI documentation, I think in an early version of their methodology standards, where it had a doctor talking to this woman and said, "Well, you look great. Your labs are great. Your blood pressure's down. Your weight's under control. I'll see you in a couple of months." And she says, "I don't feel great. Like, when can I garden again? When can I do this?" That's what PCORI cares about. They want to try to get at the outcomes that patients care about, not the outcomes that doctors care about. Now, you can argue that. You can say, well, I'm a doctor, and damn it, she should get her blood pressure down, or he should get his weight down. But that's what they're focusing on. And I think that's really a key thing to think about in your grant. And could you come up with some cartoon of a patient like talking about the outcomes you're going to collect as being important to them? Okay. I also want to paraphrase a former colleague of mine, Mark Roberts, who's he recently stepped down as the chair of health policy management at Pittsburgh. And he's a physician who treats geriatric patients with diabetes. And he said to me, he kind of started a lot of our infrastructure there with CER that I kind of inherited from him as he moved up to department chair. And he mentioned that, he treats these diabetes patients, and there's all this information. And I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but he says something like, and this was also 20 years ago, there's like 38 FDA approved diabetes medications. And there's been all of these RCTs, many, many different RCTs on diabetes medications, and just make sure they're better than placebo. But he has a 103-year-old patient at the time. He's like, that patient would not have qualified for any of those RCTs. He would have gotten excluded from every one of them. And so he says, NIH has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on these explanatory trials trying to figure out, does this work better than placebo? Is it safe? Is it efficacious? Does it bring down HbA1c? And that's important, but it doesn't help his patient at all. So I think of that also when I think of CER. So I think of Mark's patient. And just, I want to emphasize this point about CER and comparing A versus B. So again, it could be as many treatments or interventions as you want to compare. I see a lot of CER studies, they'll compare like 3 different ways, like maybe 2 different doses of medication and a different standard medication. So more than 2, but A and B, let's say it's 2, must work some of the time for some of the patients. I've repeated that purposely a number of times. Neither, so I want to be very specific here, just if you're an investigator thinking, hey, I'm interested in PCORI. Neither of those can be placebo. So if you're looking at your drug versus placebo, forget, that's not CER. You may be able to justify usual care if either usual care is some process that we know is efficacious. Like, so maybe usual care is they take an aspirin and they exercise or something like that. And we know that works. Well, let's say we know that works for some condition. Then that's fine. That could be a comparator. Or they also allow for usual care if it is universally used. So even if we don't know it works, if it's what everyone is doing all the time. I do want to mention, this is something it's really hard to do in a PCORI proposal, but it's really important that usual care must be well defined. So you can't just say, well, usual care, somebody comes into the doctor's office and whatever happens, happens. Maybe some of the doctors immediately give him this medication, some of them give him other tests, blah, blah, blah. PCORI is not going to accept that as a comparator. Why? Because they want evidence that they can give back to patients that says, if you do this, this is better for these types of people. If you do this, it's better for these types of people. And if you can't say what this is, then you really can't give patients guidance or information. So they're very strict on that. In fact, they have a whole set of methodology criteria, and I'll talk about that in the 3rd workshop, that talks about how to define usual care. So they want you to do that well. A little trick I've learned is that sometimes it helps if you call it enhanced usual care. So you might say, well, I can't compare it to usual care then, because usual care at my hospital or the doctor's office, they come in, they do whatever. Well, then maybe you come up with some process that you can get buy-in and say, hey, we would like, if you're part of this study, you give them this informational handout, you have them take this psychological assessment, you do this, you do that. Some addition to it, and what I've seen, as I said, and this is in published studies, so I'm not giving away anything here, maybe even give it a different name. And this, like enhanced usual care. Enhanced usual care is all these things. And that kind of helps reviewers of PCORI accept it. Both
I have a
A and
question about
B.
usual care, if you don't
Sure.
know.
Yeah, go ahead.
And they might need to help me with this because I'm not 100%. I think I know what it says. It says, would they still consider usual care if we have evidence that it is harmful? And it also works some of the time for some of the patients. So if we're
Sure.
not 100% sure about what that means, they might need to come on and tell us more.
I mean, I would just say if it's potentially efficacious, if you think it works some of the time for some of the people, and even though it's usual care, we think it's doing some harm, that is still a comparator. Unless you feel that it's to the point where, you know what, we're doing it, but I don't feel like it's ethical. Obviously, if it's not ethical, then just throw it out the window. But I would say that's definitely within defined usual care. all treatments need to be feasible in practice. Here's one thing to note. PCORI in general, although they have a pilot program that makes some exceptions, they will not even fund the intervention. So a lot of times with NIH studies, I'm part of an NIH immunosuppression trial right now in kidney transplant, also in liver transplant. It's a small study. We have a small number of patients, and it's millions of dollars because it's super expensive to do. And so we have a lot of funding, millions of dollars from NIH to do this immunosuppression, dendritic cell kind of infusion to a donor. PCORI will not fund the intervention because they want interventions that if you prove or you have a study which shows that they're effective, they want it to have uptake in practice. And I'll get back to that with the criteria. They do have an exception. They have this pilot program where you can say, I need you to fund it. But if you fund it, I'm pretty sure health systems will pay for it then. And then you get letters from the health system. So some exceptions possibly. I do want to say one thing, and again, starting to jump into some hints that I think are helpful. I mentioned a few times that PCORI wants research to fund research of interventions as they are implemented in practice. So there's this tool that looks like a bicycle wheel called the Precis 2 diagram. Precis is for the pragmatic explanatory continuum index summary or something like that. It says how pragmatic is the study. And these little numbers here, like take eligibility on the top spoke. 5 is the most pragmatic, and they give little, next to these numbers, they give descriptions of them in this publication. I'm sorry, I should have put the reference here. If you just Google Precis 2, it'll come up. So 5 would be anyone who might be this condition or this disease might be relevant to who we may want to treat to get into the trial. 1 would be super inclusive. So think NIH kind of explanatory trials where we have a million different exclusion criteria to make sure it's safe. And if it's going to work for anyone, it'll work for you kind of thing. That's a 1. A 3 is right in the middle. And then you can kind of get 4 and 2 in the middle of either 3 and 5 or 3 and 1. I've had a number of investigators before they submit a PCORI proposal. They actually do a Precis 2 diagram for their proposed study. And I think that helps reviewers visualize and understand how pragmatic it is. So just, again, another little hint to give. I do want to, so were there other questions we should pause for now, Catherine, or should I keep going?
No more questions.
No.
I just put the survey in, and I also put the figure URL that you were just talking about in the chat.
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to say a few words about what PCORI thinks in terms of they want research done differently. And what do they mean by that? So I've boiled it down to a couple of steps. They want patients driving the research question. So they do not want the research question coming from researchers. They do not want it coming from their physicians, and they certainly do not want it coming from their biostatisticians. They want it coming from patients. Now, does this happen a lot where patients get involved and patients say, hey, I want this research question answered? Well, sometimes. Probably more often than not, it's a kind of retroactive thing like, researchers think about it. And then they go talk to patients and say, hey, wouldn't this be great? Can you fill out the survey saying how much you care about this? But they want evidence that patients really care about the research question. So here's some suggestions. I'm going to try in these slides to give very concrete suggestions I found helpful. One of the things that I've seen done is to have a table that says, here's our original specific aims, our original plan. Here's the input we got, and here's how we revised it. So for instance, our original outcome was survival time. We did a survey of patients and they said, no, I don't need to live for 10 years. I want my quality of life high now. So they revised it and used SF36. Those kinds of tables in your PCORI application can be very powerful. This engagement, with some exceptions, must happen before the application is submitted. So if you say, you know what, we've got some patients out there, we're going to go ask them if we get funded. That will not go over big. Now, there's some exception. They have a very large phased award, which actually has a feasibility kind of section to it where you can use that time to engage stakeholders. But even still, you want your discussions, your engagement with stakeholders to happen before you ever finalize your specific aims. A second step is they want patients engaged appropriately throughout. So in your application, you should have a table or tables of all the ways you're going to engage patients and details on them. So if you just say, we've got some patients, they said they're interested, we're going to put together a committee, that will not cut it. You need to say, here's 20 different time points, so far, before we ever applied, we had these focus groups. We got this information. After we had the focus groups, we proposed what we were going to do. They provided feedback. Then we revised our aims. And then as soon as we get funded, what we're going to do is we're going to show them the protocol. We're going to get information. After they do that, we'll revise. And you want to show all these different steps and activities with specifics. PCORI has guidelines on engagement, and part of that is they expect fair compensation. So if you propose to have advisors who are high-level leaders in the field, and you're going to pay them $300 an hour, and you're going to give the patients a $10 grocery card for the Wegmans, that will not cut it. Okay, they expect fair engagement as part of the team. These are a couple links I think are helpful. One is for a rubric for engaging patients, and the other is a new one. To be honest, I've hardly looked at this. This came up the last time I was reviewing for PCORI, where they now have these foundational expectations for partnerships in research. So you need to look at these and be well-versed in them before you put in PCORI projects. And then you need to critically assess your applications. A third step, I would say, going further in the continuum is that there needs to be what I'll say is sort of non-standard dissemination efforts. So just publishing papers is not enough. So if you should have, I think, a table of dissemination activities or some kind of figure or something like that. So if you just say, we're going to publish, we're going to present at a conference, we're going to present to our advisory committee, even that will not cut it because other people, so PCORI was doing that 15 years ago. What they want now is more sophisticated approaches. We have a stakeholder panel. They give monthly webinars to their patient advocates. We're going to be in there. We're going to create this this pamphlet that's well suited for patients and them understanding, and we're going to give them this pamphlet. We're going to, put in reports. We're going to do all these kinds of things. So again, publishing, presenting scientific stuff, not enough. You have to reach the right audience with appropriate technical detail. And I do want to mention, and we're getting toward the end here, these requirements are baked into the merit review criteria. PCORI has changed their merit review criteria many times over the years. I remember when I was at Pittsburgh and I did one of these seminars and I gave this presentation. I thought it was a nice presentation. At the time, they had like 9 different review criteria. I literally got back to my office that day and I get an email and says, Doug, I'm really confused. You presented really nicely on these 9 criteria. And on the website, it looks like it's 7. That looks like it's totally different. They changed it that day. Like I checked it the day before and they changed it the next day. They've changed it a lot. I think that they are solid on their review criteria now. And so their review criteria are somewhat related, but quite different to NIH or NSF or anything else. So you have to address a gap. So there has to be a question out there of like, should I be taking a medication or should I go to physical therapy? Should I have some kind of experimental intervention or should I have medical monitoring? Should I do this or should I do that? There has to be some gap there where we just don't know. There's a decisional dilemma. There's a gap in the literature. They want to see things like systematic reviews. They want to see groups come out that there was this IOM committee and IOM said, hey, everybody's got to do research on which diabetic medication works best for elderly population or something like that. I mean, that's the best case scenario. It has to impact clinical practice. So there was a question earlier about, say, an animal study or basic science. If there's a few steps removed from clinical practice, and when I say clinical practice, I mean treatment, intervention on some kind of clinical outcome in pragmatic settings. So it doesn't have to be in a hospital or in a doctor's office or in other kind of treatment facilities. It could be treating kids with ADHD with different school-based interventions. That definitely would fall under impact on clinical practices. And you have to be able to say how your results are going to translate to physicians doing something differently. And that's a pretty high bar to do, and you have to probably be creative about that. Technical merit is the usual NIH approach, so we don't need to talk anymore about that. Investigator and environment, that's the usual NIH kind of criteria, put both into one. Now, here's the last 2 are interesting. It has to be patient-centered. So it has to be about outcomes, questions, things that patients care about. And patients have to tell you they care about, because if they don't tell you that, what's your evidence that it's patient-centered? And then the 6th criteria is patient and stakeholder engagement. So do you actually engage them? Did patients conduct a focus group with patients to say, yeah, that's important. Yeah, I care about that. Did you get information that changed your approach? It's really hard to get scored well on one without getting scored on the other. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is if you don't have patients and stakeholders involved, you're going to you're going to get a big thumbs down on 2 of 6 criteria, and you're not going to get funded. And I want to stress their reviewers include first a scientist goes, then a stakeholder, like say a healthcare administrator at the health systems at ECM and ECMC, at other health systems, then a second scientist, then a patient, and then a third scientist, and then they have readers with different backgrounds. So in the review sessions, we've probably some of you have been at NIH review sessions where the 3 reviewers give their review and we go, okay, well, we're doing okay here, but we're up to 12 minutes. So any burning questions? Nope. Okay, score your application, next application. PCORI gives a lot of time for discussion. I don't know if they want to keep that part of their review criteria confidential, so I'm not going to say. I've never seen it written anywhere, so I won't say what the time is, but I'll just say they spend a lot of time. And they do note, it's public knowledge that they have these reviewers and they have readers, and it's going to get pummeled with comments from every person. And maybe one of those people knows something about your field. So just keep that in mind. Okay, a third poll, and then we'll kind of wrap up with some points to finish. So this is which of the following is sufficient for a PCORI submission. So you have 3 different choices here. Again, just kind of want to talk about this. So just go with your first guess.
And I think we'll end the poll. And I'm sharing the results at this time.
Great. So most of the people, and that was the answer I was looking for, is patients need to be engaged at every step, starting from before funding. The other answers are perfectly good answers in terms of some things that you can do. And in fact, if the question, which of these is necessary, if that was the question, I think that there would have to be in all of the above. But the only thing, so I think it's great to have patients included on an advisory committee. Some of the projects I've worked on, we have a patient advisory committee, we have a stakeholder advisory committee, and then we've got our investigators, trying to tailor that to what you're trying to do and who are the people that have a stake in the decision. Patients should have a say in the specific aims and the outcome. Other groups that I have worked with go to some either advocacy group, or if I work with a professional society, they may have patients who are mobilized in different ways that they go to. So I think asking their input, doing focus groups is great. I'm glad no one picked 4. So 4 would be the one that would definitely want to cross off. But really 5 is the only thing that's sufficient. So let's see. Oh, okay. So let me see. I go up. Are there, before I finalize the discussion and just kind of lead us into the next workshop, are there any questions that anyone has? I'll just move forward and then I can pause again when I hit the slide. So I just want to give some final conclusions. So one thing is PCORI is specific to funding patient-centered CER. So I think we spent some time at the beginning talking about what is CER, what is PCOR, what is patient-centered CER, these related ideas. PCORI studies need to have a question, a clinical decision about, or you may say a health-related decision, they say clinical, I think more health related, comparing at least two interventions, medications, could be health system deliveries, anything that you want to look at that affects health, as they would be done in practice. PCORI studies must engage patients throughout, and they have to engage other stakeholders. So if you're looking at some kind of healthcare systems that says, we are going to look at engaging patients with this app, and we're going to compare this, one of the studies they did with UPMC that they're working on publishing is where they compared what they called a high-tech strategy, apps, messaging people, to what they called a high-touch strategy, which was seeing patients in the clinic more. Then you'd also want to have the health system have physicians involved too. I do want to make the point, and as we go through these workshops, we'll look at other challenges of PCORI, and there are many of them. I will say in full disclosure, I know more than a few researchers who have said they've been funded by PCORI and they have said, never again. I've been funded on PCORI stuff and I really enjoy it. We'll go into other things like their contracts, not grants. They have timelines, they have these methodology criteria. But the one thing I will say is they're funding interesting, two things, I guess. They're funding interesting, important research, and they have money. I know other institutes, and I won't name them by name, but I was on a panel, a review panel that I chaired for years, where they just canceled one of the review sessions. They said, you know what? There's all these people who have scored a 10, which is perfect, and we don't have enough money to fund them. So we're going to catch up and fund some of them because we don't have any more money. I have heard from PCORI that informally in discussions that in their experiences for certain review officers, we never turn people away because we don't have the money. We turn them away because with this, I'll inject the words, very complicated, rigorous review system, it's really hard to get scored well. And it's that limits them. If someone has moderate limitations, they're just not going to fund them. So it's a really good opportunity to get funding if this is the area you work in. So I'm going to stop there. This is about where I wanted to be on time. I don't like going right to the end, but I like to hopefully make good use of your time and if there's any other questions.